Are you trapped in a leasehold property, probably on a new build estate somewhere in England that has an unfair lease, high charges which double every 10 years, and a property that is potentially unsaleable? Now, we've talked about this before, these leasehold properties on new build estates, and I've talked about leaseholds in general, which are a bit of a minefield, and as an investor I avoid them, anything with the name leasehold on it. And now the UK's largest house builders have been investigated by a watchdog after evidence has emerged that the way leaseholds have been sold has been unfair, and property buyers have potentially been ripped off, misled or whatever. Major companies like Barratt Developments, these are household names, Countryside Properties, Persimmon, which had a share price, shares which were paying, I think, 12 or 13% dividends, and of course Taylor Wimpey, and these are the kind of companies that could face legal action from the CMA. That's not the Country Music Association, that's the Competition and Markets Authority, which is a watchdog that could, if they don't get the right answers, take these developers to court. Now, let's go back to the background of this. Buyers have been basically caught in a leasehold trap. You know, they bought a property, and then perhaps because they haven't read the lease, which is the normal case, they don't read the lease. The solicitor doesn't really tell them much, particularly if they're using one of these factory type solicitors that lenders say, well, you've got free conveyancing, and they use this factory solicitor. They never sit down with the solicitor, never meet them. And they've got rising ground rents, unfair fees, and properties which probably will be difficult to sell in the future. Because imagine, you know, you've got a lease that could double in 10 years, or not the lease doubles, but the fees, the ground rents could double after 10 years. Now, you know, from now, 10 years looks like a long way, but, you know, when you might sell that property, the average person stays in the property maybe about 7 years, and then it's 3 years to go, and the person buying it says, oh, this ground rent's going to double, and then it doubles again after that time. I mean, some of these ground rents will be thousands of pounds, you know, in 30 or 40 years' time. So it's really bad, and I think it's really unfair. It's such a rip-off. I mean, what is the difference between a leasehold and a freehold? A freehold is where you own the ground that the property is built on, and, you know, you can, within reason, within planning permission rules and that sort of thing, you can pretty much do what you want with that property. You can extend it, you can put a loft extension on, you can do lots of things. You can put a satellite dish on it, or, you know, whatever you want, or these well, I've lost the words now. The things, the solar panels, and all these sorts of things you can put on your property. With a leasehold, you don't own the ground that it's on. A freeholder, or sometimes called a landlord, will own the land, and then might build a lot of flats on that land, and then divides them up with a thing called a lease. And you know, that's pretty understandable in a lot of flats. But you can sell flats with a share of the freehold and just give it up. But no, the developers are not happy with making a lot of money on the development. They want to cash in on the lease and have it as a residual income forever. And, you know, okay, I think people want to make money, that's fine, but these things have gone just beyond that, and in some of the ways these have been sold. Now, when you buy a leasehold, many people really don't realise that, okay, what all the implications are. Now, obviously, a lease is, like when you lease a property, you lease a car, it's something that you have the right to use for a set period of time. Now, in the case of a property, typically a new lease would be 99 to 125 years. Some cases you might have 999 years, which are virtual freeholds. However, it's you know, they don't realise that there's all sorts of other charges on top of that as well. Ground rent, this is the rent for the ground. I mean, you've bought the bloody property and they want to charge you a ground rent on top of it. It's a nonsense. It goes back to the feudal landlords. You know, it's just a lot of bullshit. The ground rent. Now, on an old lease, if you bought an old flat, you'd look back on a lease maybe granted in 20 or 30 years ago. You'd see that the ground rent was probably £50. I remember a £25 ground rent on a property, and then that ground rent could stay the same for 40 or 50 years. Now you've got ground rents of several £100, sometimes £500 a year, and it's doubling after 10 years. And, so 10 years is going to be £1,000, 20 years is going to be £2,000. That's a lot of money for bloody ground rent for doing nothing, just sitting there. You bought the property and you got this property on their ground, and they're charging you rent as well. it's the biggest rip-off of the century. Can't people see this? So that's the ground rent, but there are also other things. There are service charges. Now, okay, in the case of a flat, you need to have services like common areas, lighting, maybe gardens to be tended and that sort of thing, bin stores and things to maintain. So you'd expect to pay a service charge. And most service charges start at around £100. But what do you get for that service charge? Well, actually, not a lot. Sometimes that service charge is just for the management company or the landlord just to collect some money, and then work on top of that is charged as extra. So that's another rip-off, and these charges can just go up and up and up, and it's a way of the freeholders or the developers just to say, well, look, we'll make a load of money building the house and selling it to people, and then we'll have the residual income, a nice little pension for us from these ground rents and that sort of thing, and service charges. Now, you'd understand buying a leasehold flat, wouldn't you? Because you think, oh, well, it's a big block and you have to have something. Even if you have a share of the freehold, you might still need a management company to run the block. And sometimes you've got self-managed properties, but I've been in one of those. It's not as easy as people think, because nobody wants to do anything. You've only got one or two people that attend a meeting, and it can end up as a bit of a joke. But it can work well in some cases, but generally people would employ a management company. Now, if you own a share of the freehold between you, at least you can control that management company, and it's not going to rip you off because they're working for you, not for the freeholder or the landlord. So it's all this is a bit of a minefield, as I've said before in previous episodes. Typically, if you buy a leasehold property in a house where you've got, say, 3 flats, you'd expect to get a share of the freehold or a pretty good lease. But it's these new builds, these big estates built by these, the Wimpeys and that sort of thing, and the Barratts. This is where people are getting ripped off left, right, and centre. Now, there are also people who are sold leasehold houses, believe it or not, or sometimes even freehold houses on these estates with service charges, with covenants and restrictive covenants. So these I would avoid at all costs, particularly leasehold houses. I mean, no one wants to buy a leasehold house, so you're never going to sell it. Well, you will sell it, but at a knockdown price to someone who just says, well, I'll take it. But it's going to be very difficult to sell. But particularly where you're on an estate where there's some flats, some houses, common areas and that sort of thing, you could end up paying similar sort of charges that you would pay on a leasehold flat. And then, this is the other downside of a lease, you need to then get permission from the landlord to make changes to the property. You might have a big flat and you want to change a 1-bed flat into a 2-bed flat because you can divide it up differently. You'd need permission from the freeholder, the landlord. Similarly with a house, you might want to say, I want an extension, I want a loft extension, permission. And you know what they charge for this permission? They don't just say, well, give us £50. It could be a lot of money just to get permission. I've had lots of run-ins with freeholders and landlords. I had a flat that I sold a few years ago, and a lot of the flats in the building, the windows had never been replaced, the doors, the patio doors had never been replaced, and one of them actually fell out of the flat onto the ground. It didn't kill anybody, but it could have done. So anyway, I decided to just get it done, and just got windows done. Same colour, looked very much the same as others. Others had got different ones. And I got this letter from the bloody landlord saying, you shouldn't have done this, and now you've got to pay us money. So £400. I told them to go and take a hike. And it went on, and then they sold it to another company. And I said, I've had enough of these greedy bugger landlords. I'm not going to deal with them anymore. And I sold it. In fact, it was a good little flat. It was giving me good rent, actually. But I regret selling it in a way. But in another way, I think, well, I probably did the right thing, because, you make a bit of rent, and then you're then paying a proportion of that in charges to these greedy landlords and management companies. In fact, I remember the ground service charge went up from £100 over a few years. Then it was £125, and it was bound to go up, because when the new management company came in and perhaps bought the interest in it, they were going to jack up the charges, and all they did was really cut the grass, So there you go. But if you've got a freehold house, that should be definitely avoided at all costs, because people want, when they buy a house, they think, well, I want to put an extension, I'll make it bigger, I want to do this, I want to do that. Now, there's other problems with these new estates. Sometimes they've got bits of land and strips of land all over the place, strips of land which could come across your garden even. And there was something on a program called Watchdog investigating that, because people were then hit with charges, or they found that they didn't own part of their back garden, and there were strips of land that were retained by the builders. And in fact, another situation I've been in was where the original builders have sold houses on a small estate maybe 50 years ago, but they've retained bits of land here and there. And then there's garages as well, and they own bits of garages, and they own the land with access rights and that sort of thing. So it's a bit of a mess. And and these retained bits of land, these bits of road, are never maintained, so they look scruffy, and the garages have become run down and that sort of thing. We'd like to develop the garages, knock them down and build houses, but we know we're going to have a tussle trying to buy the land off the original bloody developer that's hung on to this bit of land, thinking one day we'll cash in on that. So it does make me a bit angry, this whole thing. So when you buy a leasehold property, if you do decide to buy one, try and avoid them. But if you do, make sure you read the lease and get your solicitor to read the lease and look at all these things like restrictive covenants, charges, leasehold, ground rents, and all these things, and just be careful. Now, if you are in this situation and you're in a rip-off lease, then someone called Katie Kendrick, who was herself a leasehold victim 6 years ago, set up something called the National Leasehold Campaign, and has 18,000 members. There's also something called the Leasehold Knowledge Partnership, which helps to fight landlords. And I had a terrible run-in with a landlord once. I won't go into the whole story again, but it cost me a lot of money in legal fees, a lot of stress, and it was really bad. And I found out this landlord owned thousands and thousands of freeholds. They bought up freeholds fairly cheaply, and then they come in, they start jacking up charges, and in this case, the landlord was also the person who he was a surveyor, so he was appointing his own firm to do surveys of the property and charging thousands of pounds. Then he was appointing his own builder friends, and any job seemed to cost 10 times as much as you could get it if you just employed a local firm. And in the end, we revolted against this. You can also get rid of your management company through voting and do a self-management scheme. Right to manage, it's called. You can do that, and you can try and buy your freeholds. You can also extend leaseholds, because if you bought a 99-year lease that's already had 20 years to run in, you've only got 80 years left. You really want to start thinking about extending the lease. But again, you're kind of at the mercy of these the freeholder, the landlords, who think, right, great, now it's time to cash in again. Right, give me £30,000, or in some cases hundreds of thousands of pounds to extend that lease. So just be very careful and watch out for leases that go below that 80 years, because then you haven't got the statutory rights that you do have at 80 years. So there you go. As you can see, I'm not a great fan of leasehold properties. So just be careful. And if you can buy a flat with a share of freehold, that's going to be a lot better. And once again, watch out for houses on new build estates, because they can have several problems. And also with new builds, I don't think a lot of them are built very well, and there's been problems with some of them. I had a new build house years ago, and there were problems. There was subsidence even, so just be careful with that. Generally, the older properties are built better, although they can be a bit drafty. But some of the new builds are not built that well, so get a good survey when you get them done. So thanks for listening. I'm sorry it's been a bit of a rant on leaseholds, but this is important stuff. Do watch out for these leasehold traps and rip-off leases. Thanks for listening, and good night. Bye for now.